Hi, I'm organizational psychologist and career coach Pippi Kessler.
And hello, I'm Hadassah Damien, a money coach and business strategist, and this is Have a Nice Life, a career change survival podcast.
And this podcast is based on a workbook, also called Have a Nice Life, and you can get the workbook on my website, pippikessler.org, or on Hadassah's website, ridefreefearlessmoney.com.
Try typing that out every day for your entire work life. And
oh my God.
Regret.
I still think it's a good name, though.
Thank you.
So you can get the workbook. If your brain likes to look at stuff, you can get the workbook on either of our websites. And if you just like to listen with your ears, you can go back to all the previous episodes, and we're going to take you through a lot of exercises about figuring out your career and your life and your money stuff. So we've talked so far in this podcast series about things like facing up to the current economic and social conditions that you live in, and systemic barriers and social determinants, about the risk that it can feel like to think about what you need, about different ways for assembling criteria for what a good life is, for what you need in terms of time, money, preferences, values, etc. Doing some research about your ideas, learning about jobs you've never heard of, and considering possibilities that you've never thought of for your money and job. And also we talked about accepting yourself and fighting the ableist messages that tell us that there's only one correct way to have a body and brain. And Hadassah also gave a great intro to some things to think about money and self-employment, which is very wonderful. And what are we going to talk about this episode?
Today, this is our 9th podcast, but chapter 5, if you're following along in the workbook. And Pippi is going to rock your socks off. She is going to talk all about brainstorming using your criteria and research. So the goal of this step in your process is to be able to sort out ideas to ultimately come out with some loose concepts, some things you think might be right, some stuff you want to try, some guesses. And the way you're going to get there is by brainstorming. So what you need to be able to start this step is to just get okay with being 60 to 80% done. Right? You're not here to brainstorm the perfect solution TM to your life. That's not what you're coming out with today. You are in the middle of the process, not the end. So you've thought about why to get a job that fits you better. Even though we're in a harsh and changing world, you've set your visions, you've set criteria, you've done some idea expanding research. This is just a way to reel it all in and tie it together into something that has some sort of shape or forms, or maybe a couple of shapes or forms. Again, you're not coming up with your final idea. You're coming up with some stuff that you want to put in front of yourself and potentially learn from. But first, you got to make these shapes. So in this chapter, we're going to converge based on what we've learned and thought about before to get to what we're going to call a mini decision, which we'll talk about in our next episode. But this is all about the brainstorming. So I want to hand it over to Pippi, who is going to get you ready.
One more thing I just want to say before we really get into it is that if you're somebody who is listening to this in realish time, as in somebody who's been listening to the episodes as we've been rolling them out and releasing them, thank you so much for all the people who have been reaching out to us to tell us that the podcast has meant something to you and helped you, or people who've been sharing it with your friends or your family or your enemies. We've really appreciated hearing from you and hearing about how the podcast is impacting your life. And we would love you to keep getting in touch with us and telling us about how you're using the exercises and how it's going. So please keep reaching out to us. We love hearing from you. And it's been really fun to get to do this with you. This episode, I'm going to get into brainstorming. And I want to talk about a paradox that comes up with brainstorming that I find pretty interesting. So the paradox is that brainstorming is an emotional exercise in both accepting and not accepting the current constraints of reality. So let me explain a little bit more what I mean by both accepting and not accepting reality. I have a nephew named Rocco. Hi, Rocco. I love you. You're so awesome. And when Rocco was 4, we played this game one day where what the game was we were trying to invent a meal that nobody had ever eaten. And in order to play the game, we had to unhook our minds from everything we had previously eaten and everything we usually eat and brainstorm into this category of things that don't usually exist. Here's what we made. We made tuna melt nachos, which we had never eaten before. They had chips, beans, tuna, cheese, and salsa. They were also delicious. We still make them sometimes. We're like, this is awesome. We also made a cocktail that had this chocolate protein drink mix in it. That had chocolate chips in it and was mixed with Ovaltine. And we had certainly never drank that before. And what this meal is an example of is brainstorming outside of our current reality. So we were trying to take seriously the idea that there were foods that we could eat that we just didn't know about yet. And when we're doing a career brainstorm, sometimes we're doing versions of that same task. So let's say, for example, that you really love making sandcastles. That's like your happiest happy place. And you wish that you could do that as your job. And there you are, you're making a sandcastle and you're thinking, sure, I know I love this, but this is not a job. Nobody could ever make money doing this. And there's one version of brainstorming where you say, what if you did a brainstorm to try to see if you could? So when I was writing the workbook, I tried doing that brainstorm as an exercise. So I was like, all right, let me see what I can come up with if I'm imagining ways that you can make money building sandcastles as a job. And here's what I came up with. The first idea I had was that you could be a sand sculpture artist who makes sand sculptures at events. And I looked that up, and that is a real job. There are these companies that will make sand sculptures at events, like a wedding or like a corporate event. It's totally a real job. The next idea I had was being a sandcastle instructor who works at a beach resort and teaches vacationers how to make castles. I don't know if that's a real job, but it could be a job. A sandcastle YouTuber, you make these videos and the whole shtick is that everyone's, oh my God, that looks just like a whale or whatever thing you made. And you're like, yeah, that's my thing. I'm a YouTuber. The next idea I had was doing sandcastle marketing. Like maybe people would pay you to make an ad in the sand for their thing. Sometimes you're at the beach and something flies above the beach. Like maybe you make like ads on the beach out of sand, or you make sandcastle proposals where you write, will you marry me in sand? Hadassah is laughing. And this could be a real job.
That would be an awesome job. It would be so fun.
Will you marry me, Rhonda?
Yeah, you'd have your like romantic goth font package. You'd have your like boho package with little like flowers scattered about. You could have your stark modernist package that just had some driftwood near it. You could take this places.
People who live by the sea, is this a real job? Have you ever heard of this? I want to know. Okay, my next idea that I had is that you are not making like proposal sandcastle art. You're making sandcastle avant-garde art. And you get these grants to make your installations. And then you teach at NYU where you're talking to 18-year-olds about installations and about that kind of art making. The next idea I had is that you run a sandcastle nursery school where the backyard of the nursery school is sand. And kids come and outside time is like you go out in the sand and you make sandcastles with them. And my last idea was to be a sandcastle art therapist. So you're an art therapist, you go to art therapy school, but your medium is sand. And you have a little studio that's like right on the beach and people come and you make therapeutic sandcastles. Hadassah, which one of those would you want to do the most?
As in, would I be a customer of? It would be sandcastle art therapy because it's about time, the sands of time.
What does it mean to you that the castle gets washed away every time and cannot
That's right.
stay?
What does it mean to you that the base of the castle is compacted, but the top of the castle just blows away? What does it say?
Who does this castle remind you of, Hadassah?
Yeah. If this castle was a character from your life, what would it say to you? There's so much. You could take it places. And here's the thing, Pippi and I might take that job, but there's I think, unlimited market for sandcastle art therapy customers.
Literally everyone wants it. Okay, I'm joking also, but do you see what I'm getting at here by giving these examples? It's not usual to make money as a sandcastle artist, but it also might not be impossible. In fact, when I was doing this exercise, which was a topic I had never thought about, I found out that it is currently, at this moment, multiple people's jobs. And that's part of what is so wonderful about brainstorming, is that sometimes we discover that what we thought was absolutely impossible actually could exist. There's an opposite version of career brainstorming, though, that's about accepting the constraints of reality as the setting and the starting point of the brainstorm. So here's a different example. Very few poets financially support themselves purely from writing poetry. And I can actually only think of one person I have ever heard of who did that. And it was my friend, Jonah's friend, Nasime, who writes typewriter poetry. She writes on-demand typewriter poetry in Union Square. Stop by, get a poem. She's delightful. But she also, in her life, has done a lot of gigs. So I don't know if she would even say, yes, that's the only way that I was making money during that time. For most poets, if they're doing a brainstorm, how can I support myself only writing poetry? And only my own most pure work is very small. And there's only maybe one bullet point on that list. It's you would have to become the most famous poet ever, but also the highest paid poet of all time. Better paid than current and past famous poets who have rich families or supplement their income with things like teaching. Think about if you've ever heard of a poet who did not do some other kind of jobby thing, like they taught somewhere. You don't know that poet because they are not real. Maybe they are real, but they just have a real rich daddy. That's about it. And that's a really big problem. It's not poets' fault that in our current society, poetry is typically very low paid. A poet who's doing a really good career brainstorm, though, they very likely have to do a type of brainstorm that's about accepting the constraints of those current conditions. So if you're like, I've decided I definitely want to be a poet as my job, then that brainstorm about how do I support myself, it might include these different things, like one, that you have a writing related money gig. You become a teacher. You teach at a university, or you teach in a middle school, or you teach in a community center, etc. It might mean that you have a money gig that's not related to writing. So you're a carpenter, or you work at a library or something like that. I guess working at a library is related to writing. But you get what I'm saying. It's like you work at a job, but the job isn't writing.
You're like hustling the writing. You're not doing the writing in that case.
Yeah. You're a writing pusher. That's what I'm going to start calling librarians.
But I also want to point out here that it's like in the design of your life and your career and the things that you're doing, part of what you're asking is how can I enable poetry and enable other criteria to be met? And so that's where the bigger shape of the thing within reality. That's right.
Yeah, it's like a math problem brainstorm. How do I meet need A, which is writing poetry, and need B, surviving in capitalism? There's a third thing that might be a category of your brainstorming, which is that you say, no, I only want to make money purely from selling poems or from money I make selling tickets to poetry readings or passing a hat at a poetry event. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to drop my expenses very low. So
which is a criteria change.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You're saying I'm going to drop my expenses really low so that I don't need to figure out as much about how to make money from doing it. I'm going to take that away by lowering my expenses. And that also is real and working within the constraints of reality. All of those different options could be really good lives that are filled with lots of poetry. And it's also, of course, a good life to be an arts activist and to fight for the conditions to change for artists, like to be someone who's organizing for more social support for artists. But it just might not be a fight that you win in time to pay rent this month. So a lot of times, it's not that we're saying the conditions could never change, a lot of times when we're doing like a brainstorm like this, we're saying, I don't think they're going to change in time for me to finish this brainstorm. And that's why we're constraining it. I am trained in a coaching methodology called Designing Your Life. And the guys who created it are named Bill and Dave. They are people who had a background in different kinds of design work and product design and consulting, blah, blah. And then they also were professors at Stanford in the Stanford Design Lab, which is like a particular universe of design thinking. And in their methodology, and you can read about this in their books too, if you want to see a picture of it or see more about how they describe this, they use an image that they call the maker mix. And it's a picture of a mixing board with 3 sliders, one for money, one for impact, and one for self-expression. And each of those operates with a different kind of currency. Also, if you want to see a picture of this, it's in the workbook too. Hadassah, you want to give an example of this?
Oh, fantastic. So let's bring in another arts example. So say that you're a painter and you're thinking about, okay, how do I want to mix my money, my impact, and my self-expression within this particular set of gifts that I really want to make sure I include? So for your money gig, you might make Christmas paintings, right? Even if you hate Christmas or hate making Christmas paintings and you think Norman Rockwell is a jerk, but you might be like, okay, there's one opportunity in my money mix, on my money slider. You might think about running a arts after school program, which has a lot of impact on kids, even though it might not bring in as much money and you don't make your own work, but maybe that's high on the impact part of your scale. You might make your own poop painting series in your basement, right? Maybe you are just following along with your truest expression and it's never going to make any money and it might never be seen by anyone or have any impact, but it is like full tilt expression. So that is expression slider. And when you're thinking about your sliders, it's okay to set each of the sliders where it's right for you, but it's about what's the mix that helps you enjoy your sliders, but also think about a life that gives you things that you want and fits in reality. Pippi, how else do we think about the maker mix?
Why this is important to think about is that sometimes when we're trying to get the currency of one slider in the modality of the other, we can feel really disappointed. So for example, if you were trying to get rich off of your poop painting series and you couldn't sell any, you might be like, I'm failing. What's wrong with me? But if you were really just trying to express yourself as an artist, then you might feel actually really happy and satisfied. Like, I really got to express myself in exactly the way that I wanted to, and I'm so glad. So sometimes we feel disappointed when we're not clear with ourselves about which slider am I trying to work on here, or what is this gig that I'm doing about for me. So that's part of why it's really important. The other thing also is that, Hadassah, I want to apologize for you for putting an example in this workbook that would cause you to say the phrase poop painting series. That might be a life experience you never want to have. And that's on me.
It was a surprise. But that's what self-expression is about, right? Self-expression is about just writing the things you want to write.
This is my truest art. And I need it. Recently, I was talking on the phone with my nephew, Rocco, which also is an amazing new thing that we're able to do now. And he was telling me about a situation at school. And I was like, oh, wow, it sounds like that's a real poop soup. And he just looked at me and said, please don't say that. I was like, I'm sorry, split pea soup. He was like, thank you. Anyways, okay, so the sliders. All right, let me give you a couple more examples because that was a specific example for artists, but this isn't really just about being an artist. This is something that comes up for all of us in different ways and different fields. So here's a totally different example. If you're a software designer, like a software developer, I don't actually know about what that job does. So if you are one and I'm about to say the words wrong, I'm sorry. So you might have a big money gig for a tech company and you're trying to make money and that's what that's about for you. It's not about expressing yourself. It's not about these other things. And you might have another part of work that you do that's more like your expression work, which is that you're trying to start your own startup thing that's riskier on the side. Different example. Let's say you're a social worker and you're trying to figure out the balance of working at this low-paying community clinic where you feel like you make a really deep impact and it means a lot to you, and then also these wealthy private practice therapy clients that pay you a lot but are really boring for you. Also, unfortunately, this is a real example that I hear about coaching social workers all the time because that field is fucked up and unfair. And if anyone is listening who's the king of the world and can change the conditions for social workers, please do that. It's so unfair. Social workers who do community work need to be paid more fairly for how fucking hard they work, and I hate it. Okay, so here's the example. You might have 2 gigs, so you work part-time at the community clinic, and that's low paying. And then you have part-time, you have private therapy clients, and that's high paying, and that's how you put it together for money. You might get your impact need met at the community clinic, and your self-expression, you might feel like it's in the middle because sometimes during the week you feel like it's really high, like when you're at the clinic, and sometimes you feel like it's pretty low, like when you're doing your private clients. If you were, say, working in communications at a nonprofit, the expression slider doesn't always mean like expression, like artistic expression. I sometimes think of it also as including these other things that are about what your preferences are, about how you like to work and be. So you might have a job that's high on that expression slider for you because you really love your coworkers and you feel really psychologically safe and the benefits are good and you get to take a lot of vacations. So it might be that the expression part isn't really about the content you're doing. It's that it really works for you as a lifestyle. And the money might be like fine, like in the middle, and the impact might be fine, like not amazing and also not great, but it's like you like your life there. It's like how you want to be. So those are just some more examples to help you understand how you might think about the sliders.
So if you want to try the make or mix exercise, you could draw or sketch out or get wild, make a little spreadsheet if you like, but you're going to think about what is your current life like and what is your, as compared to that, what is your ideal mix right now of money making, impact, and expression? This is another way of asking what's really important to you. And like if you were just from a dead stop trying to figure out what matters to me right now, money making, impact, and expression. And then you're going to brainstorm about ways to improve the sliders that are important to you from your current life, right? So if your current life, money is low and impact is low and self-expression is low, you've only got up to go, my friend. And you're going to try a round of brainstorming where in this brainstorm, you're aiming to break the boundaries of your current reality, right? How can you move those sliders? What would you need to change to move those sliders based on your criteria, the things you thought about, the research that you did? How could you do that first part of brainstorming, right? Come up with new things. Is there a way you could make a living as a sandcastle artist or a mime or an experimental app developer? And then you're going to think about your sliders and some other types of jobs that might be coming together for you and do the other side of brainstorming. What's true within the current constraints of reality? What if actually you realized or felt that you couldn't make a living as a sandcastle artist or mime or experimental app developer? How else might you get money to the level of your slider that you want? Create impact to the level of the slider that it matters to you, and express yourself to the level of the slider that you need. And sometimes even just framing this question the other way gives you additional ideas. So your job here is you want to start thinking about, even if you don't know if they're real yet, but types of jobs or types of things that you might try to do to help you land on those parts of the slider where you really want to be. What else, Pippi, should we think about?
There's some other things to think about also about the concept of self-expression related to employment. and related to expressing yourself through your work in capitalism, because this is something that can also be confusing. Constraints sometimes actually can be fun or interesting. Like they can reveal interesting options. This is part of why magnetic fridge poetry sometimes can be really fun, because sometimes it's like just fun and creative to be like, you can only use these words. But there's another version of constraints that's extremely oppressive and crappy. And one of the versions of this is the way people have to make decisions about working in the arts. It really sucks. It's not like a creative constraint. It's a shitty constraint that most dancers can't make a living dancing. And of course, part of why this bothers me is because both my mother and spouse are modern dancers. So it's something that I've thought about a lot. Also, sorry, Freud, my mother and spouse are both modern dancers. You were right, whatever. Shut the fuck up. Okay. But so I know that this is something that's part of even being the best dancer that you know, even the person who is like the most successful, the most frequently cast, it does not actually solve this problem that dancers have to figure out about how hard it is to make it work financially. And what this creates is a secret class dynamic in fields like dance, where even people who appear to be making it work often have a secret. Not like that they're trying to keep a secret necessarily, but it creates like a sub layer of how people are making it work that's not immediately obvious. So you look at a bunch of people who all look like they're making it work in the arts, and if you really scratch the surface, you find, oh, that person actually has a secret trust fund. That's how they're making it work. It's not that they're making it work in dance, or that person secretly has a spouse supporting them. And if you're my spouse, that spouse secretly supporting them is me, Pippi Kessler. and again, this is not saying my spouse is like one of the most successful and frequently cast dancers that I've ever known, who's been able to work professionally in the field for decades. And so it's not about like how good somebody is. It's about the constraints that are on how people work in the field. Also, side note, if you've bought a workbook and are therefore supporting me, that also means you're supporting a dancer and you are a patron of the arts, and you can put that on your resume. Philanthropist. You're a philanthropist. Here's the other thing also that makes this even worse. So even people who make it work in whatever way they made it work, so they have a patron spouse or they have reached the pinnacle of the dream in whatever field they're in, like they got a big show in this big museum, or they got cast in this big show or whatever. Sometimes when that happens to them, they notice that they don't feel, I've reached peak self-expression. They feel really stressed. And when this really sunk in for me is that for a bunch of reasons that I could tell you about some other time, there's been a number of times in my life when I've been really close with somebody who is a comedian, and during the time we were close friends, made it. So they got the job that's like the dream job, and whatever that means to comedians. And what those friendships taught me was something that I don't think I would have known otherwise. And that's why I want to tell you in this episode about what I found out from them, because it really blew my mind when I saw this happen to them. So they actually had it happen to them, that they got the job that is the motivating factor to young comedians when they're hustling. So when young comedians are going through years of humiliation, uncertainty, low pay, pain, harassment, they're being spurred on by this idea that at a certain point, if you something, you get relief from all of this. The prize is that you get to experience this kind of sublime self-expression, and you get to love your job. These people who I knew, like when it happened to them, they were really happy, right? Okay, so let me tell you what some things I saw for them. When I would hang out with them during the time that they made it, I would hear, and if I said to my friends things like, hey, how are you doing lately? How are you feeling about work? Also, if you are one of those friends and you're listening to this, is like a composite of multiple people. So I'm not talking about you, any one person in specifically. These are like patterns I saw. I would hear this pattern of people saying things like, I feel really unsteady all the time. I feel like I could get fired at any minute. Or The things that I'm being forced to work on through the bigger system or the changes that are being made to my work are such huge compromises that I can't sleep because of how upset I am. Or they would say things like, the people who I'm working with, they're basically being abusive to me, and I feel like I'm not allowed to make boundaries with them because even though I have all the success now, I feel I'm fundamentally replaceable and that they're just going to drop me if I create too much friction or make too much noise. Or people would say, okay, I had this really, really big hit, but the studio or whatever, they wanted it to be even bigger. And so they felt like it was a failure, even though it was a hit. And now I feel like a failure. And then also I would hear people talk about money, like financial insecurity, like the financial uncertainty of this kind of success makes me feel afraid all the time, even though the scale is so much bigger than what my career was like before. So this is another paradox of saying, but didn't they make it? And it's important to know that there's some evidence from the very few people who maybe have that even that does not resolve some of these bigger questions that are part of the dysfunction of the field and the dysfunction of how the culture messes with artists and uses artists and doesn't support artists. That doesn't mean to say that there's no good arts jobs at all, or you shouldn't have that dream, or that everything sucks for people who make it. That's not what I'm saying here. Just that when we're talking about that expression slider, our true needs and feelings are the ultimate arbiter of if we're really happy, not anybody else's perception of how you should feel about a job or how somebody else would feel or what you've been told is going to happen to you if you follow an industry's rules. If you get some kind of success in your field, but you're not happy, you don't have to pretend you're happy because somebody else wishes they could get what you have. That's a form of the coercion that's part of those fields where they're telling you you're not allowed to talk about how you really feel because somebody else could replace you and they want what you have. That's not right, and that's not a healthy way for a field to be set up. It's really not fair at all that it's so financially unsustainable to be most kinds of artists. And it's also not fair that it's emotionally unsustainable. And it's also not fair that it's taboo for people who work professionally as artists to talk about the struggle that they're experiencing in trying to make it work. So there's these double taboos. It can be taboo to talk about what can be bad from making money about personal expression. Like people are like, oh my God, that would make my dream job. There would be nothing wrong with that. So it's taboo to say, actually, making it in Hollywood was really bad for me. Or actually, being a full-time poet, I was super stressed all the time and I hated all the things I had to do to make that work for me. And it can also be taboo to talk about the joy of just working for money. Although I do feel like that taboo is changing, like at this moment in the history of the culture, of the world's culture, the culture of work.
And to me, it makes me go back to the slider. Like there's this myth that if you can turn each of the sliders all the way up, that you'll be happy and satisfied. But that's not necessarily true, right? Pippi's talking about this example where your self-expression slider is all the way up and your money slider is all the way up and your impact slider is all the way up. And therefore you've made it and it's great. But that's actually not the case. And I'm thinking about friends who have been in writers' rooms and had jobs maybe similar to the comedian example, where it is not as satisfying as you might think, or as maybe we've been sold to have full self-expression correlated to our expectation of money and impact, which doesn't mean let go of the dream of self-expression or impact or money in your life. It just means, what if we disaggregate them from each other and start to push back against some of these myths about what's supposed to be happening and the taboos about talking about when it doesn't work and how else we can make it work, especially if we're creative or want to have some creative aspect to the overall design of our lives and what we're doing with our time.
And I really like that you were talking about disaggregating the sliders, because something that I talk about a lot when I'm coaching people is that there's no morality to making different decisions about the sliders. It's fine if you need to have a money era where actually you're supporting one of your siblings and you just had twins and you're like, you know what, right now, yeah, it's my top priority that I need to bring in income to make my life work. That doesn't mean that you have given up on yourself or you're bad. It's okay if you have different eras in your life. And it's also okay to prioritize them over each other. They're not like a seesaw where when one goes up, the other must go down. They're not a set of trade-offs. They operate independently, and you might have times in your life where they're all high, or times where they're all low, or times where they're in the middle, and where you're ranking them and have a priority set about which is most important to you. And there is no morality to any of those scenarios. You didn't create the situation where you have to figure out all of those on the current conditions. And however you want to solve it is okay. And I also personally find it very liberating that some people don't mind at all having money jobs where they don't feel like they're expressing themselves at work. And the person who really taught me that the most is my sister, Pammy, who is a writer. She's an unbelievable genius. She's just so inspiring and incredible and awesome. And one of the things that she did that I really was amazed by at the time that she did it, because it hadn't occurred to me to do this, was that she purposefully picked a job that wouldn't use her creativity during the day. That was one of her criteria. She was like, look, I want all my creativity to be mine. I want it to be all waiting for me when I'm done after work. And she did some looking around. What are the options? She considered being an actuary. That was one of the things she considered. I was like, I've never heard of that. She was like, I've been researching jobs that don't use your creativity. And what she settled on is being a medical billings coder. So the way insurance works is that all these different medical things have codes that go with them, and the codes are used by insurance companies. It's like a whole thing where there need to be people who know how to enter these specialized codes. So she's a medical billings coder, and this is a job that doesn't express her inner life. And she is one of the most authentically, fully expressed, fully satisfied people I have ever met. Because she knows what she's doing when she goes to work. She's not, what am I doing? Who am I? She's, here I am executing the plan that I came up with for myself to get money so that after work, I can be happy and free in the apartment that I can pay for with this job. Amazing. The Pammy method, though, that I'm describing, it doesn't work for everybody. Other people talk about that if they don't feel some kind of personal connection to their work, that they really don't feel able to get the work done. And of course, the asterisk on this is that these decisions I'm talking about, the different aspects, there are sometimes when people really do not have the option to decide or influence what their options are very much at all. If you are just learning English, you have just moved to the US, sometimes you're like, look, I have to just figure out how I'm going to make this work. And I'm actually not really going to think that much about, oh, what would be most preferable to me? It's like Maslow's hierarchy where you're like, survival, yup, let's get this done. And these questions are less relevant. But for when people have their survival needs and they're asking themselves more of these preference, self-actualization questions, some people find that if they don't feel that their work is interesting to them, they really can't do it. This is something that a lot of people with ADHD describe. It's not an option to pick a job if they have the choice that's totally just for money because it's not motivating enough to complete the work tasks. And just to be clear, when I say not motivating enough in the context of people with ADHD, it's not saying they don't care. It's saying that it's not providing enough like neurochemical action to be able to complete the task, which is different from motivation as a feeling or a belief. Also, if you don't know what I just said, give me a call. We could talk about it later. But I'm saying basically, I'm not calling people who need that lazy or unmotivated. I'm saying there are actual differences in how people's brains work that change what's required for them to be able to do their jobs. There's also different amounts of pressure placed on different people about how much certainty they need to have about how much money a gig is going to make. So that depends on our class backgrounds, our culture of origin, our family and communal obligations, and a lot of other things. So some people don't have the option in their context to choose to not make money. And so that's another part of it that's also a constraint. So if you want to do an exercise about this, here are a couple prompts. So get out your notebook or your sketch pad or your voice, whatever. And here's 2 prompts. The first prompt is, how self-expressed do I need to be at work? And the second prompt is, would it work for me to have a just for money gig, or would it not work for me?
Now that we're in this what if part of our brainstorming, there's a couple things that we have also noticed that might get in the way. We started talking about it with some of our arts jobs examples, but this idea or this mythology or this like collective storytelling that we have about how there's a dream job. And somehow if you just finagle your life in a certain way, you just get to be happy all the time. And somehow everything just fits together and it's perfection. And even the people I know, myself included, who do work that we find interesting, that we really like, there's absolutely moments where you're just filling out some paperwork like bored. There's going to be parts of any job that aren't going to hit your dopamine and send you to the moon, right? And with joy. You don't have to, and that's just like aspects of jobs, but you could even think about your whole job. You don't have to love your job. You don't have to have happy dreams of going to work. You could have a dream of a solid job where you can close the door, the laptop, and move on with your life, right? Some variation of the Pammy job. You could have a job, again, back to the sliders, where you are expressed enough or you're making enough impact. The idea here is that we don't want to let the myth of perfection or some dream job get in the way of imagining what might be possible or what might actually work for you. A place we see things that might get in the way of the exercise is trying to load too much into the job piece. And so the question here to ask yourself is, what if my job covers some of my criteria and gives me time and money to cover other criteria? So if you're thinking about your criteria for your life and you want to live by the ocean and be messing around with sandcastles, and they're just some of the most important things. What if you had a job where you worked afternoons from 12 to whatever time, 7, and you could spend your whole mornings on the beach and you made enough money, right? Like, you can also think about this idea of disaggregating, separating out where things get to show up in your life so that job is still serving your criteria and things that you want. It's just not directly the place where those things happen. And that's okay. God, if we just look back 80 years, especially in the US, we look at labor history, people weren't running around imagining that their job was some sort of source of satisfaction. It was a means to an end. And not that we want to go back to any earlier time in labor history where there was less regulation, but there's been this perpetuating myth that the job has to be everything and we are our jobs and all things must happen at work, which does not have to be the case. So we don't have to load too much into work. We could think of it as one design element of our life. Another thing I'm thinking about here is, now I'm on this impact slider. Sometimes we could feel like if I'm doing a job, it has to be the most important, useful job that is changing every possible systemic problem. And if not, I am a garbage failure who is burning the planet actively with my own 2 hands. And I just want to say, look, our individual choices are not the root solutions to systemic problems. Except if you're like a policy person who can make that the case, please go do that. But most policy people can't. And if you're not, do your best, right? The material truths of our current era are facts. And just because you might not be able to solve the environmental crisis, move forward in energy transition, and white supremacy and the inequality of wealth, that doesn't mean that your job's not worth doing, right? You don't have to have every impact, and you don't have to abandon your moral core, right? Our moral cores do matter, but sometimes we can over-attach to how much we're supposed to be doing and get ourselves into a point of moral outrage about work, and where we're no longer operating with wisdom or discernment, right? Where we're just like in a state of like pre-existing pain and perfectionism. And I do sometimes see people get on this pendulum where you're expecting impossible criteria from yourself or from the job that you might be considering. And therefore, because it's impossible, every job looks like it's bad, quote unquote, because it's not perfectly aligned with the highest slider of impact. So if you want to have the perfect world-changing job at the perfect organization and make the perfect amount of money, that's unlikely to happen. So how do we operate in reality and set expectations that we can meet? Look, if you don't want to help big oil, don't work for Shell, but also don't expect yourself to single-handedly take down Shell. If you want to resist capitalism, maybe you don't want to work in private equity, but somewhere you got to get money. So it doesn't mean that you're bad. It means you're living in reality. And so as you're thinking about what might be possible for you, I really want to encourage all of us to, if we notice ourselves being like, oh, this whole type of job is bad or it's not good enough, ask ourselves who's talking and what's telling us that, and to be open to potentially investigating a little bit more, because that can also open you to other possibilities. I'm thinking now again about our sandcastle artist. If you want to be putting proposals, will you marry me, out on the beach, you're also going to have to go find customers, ask them for money, process credit card payments. You're going to have to support big wedding, potentially. You know what I mean? If you got too perfectionistic about it, you might never open yourself up to the opportunity of how you could actually be a sandcastle artist after all. So I want you to notice if you find yourself in a place where you're like, nothing's good enough, everything is tainted. But yeah, everything's tainted, my friends. What's your window of tolerance for imperfection when it comes to work? Right? Or the Pammy example. Pammy's a medical biller. The medical system is really fucked up and insurance companies are pretty heinous. Does that make Pammy and her job bad? No. That makes Pammy strategic, working within the constraints of reality. Right? So I want us to not overcorrect or overattach when it doesn't actually help us. All right.
Also, if you ever want to hear just some of the sharpest, most well-informed critiques of how medicine works in the US, talk to Pammy, because it's a delight to talk to her about it.
Insider knowledge. I love it.
We just gave you a lot of different things to think about things that might get in the way of you brainstorming, that you might feel impaired or inhibited from brainstorming because you're like, wait, but all of these things are impure. Or, but how do I figure out the purest way to whatever my art? And we're trying to free you from that by talking a lot about some of those themes so that by the time you get to this exercise, you're like, all right, let's brainstorm. So let's brainstorm. The way that you open a brainstorm is that you take out your list of criteria. And there's an example that we gave before. We were giving different examples of what that criteria list sounds like from the exercises that were in the other episodes. So an example criteria list might sound like, okay, I live close to friends. I have a lot of free time. I work on intellectually challenging topics. I make $94,000 to $104,000 a year. I move my body a lot during the day, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to do an example where we work a little bit on this sample criteria, but there's something that we just wanted to bring up before we work on the example.
Yeah, and it's Money Girl here to talk to you about it, because one of these bullet points that might stand out to you is the one where Pippi just said, making $94,000 to $104,000 a year. And you might be thinking to yourself, are you rich people maniacs? Are you trying to Is this the X Games? What are you talking about? Some of you might feel really and potentially off by that number. And some of you might read that number and be like, oh, yeah, that's normal times, every day, moving right on. Money is fake and relative. Nothing is real. We hemmed and hawed about how much income to put in this example. And we thought a really high number might be triggering for some people or out of reach or make the whole thing that we're talking about feel difficult to engage with. However, on the other hand, having a high income number might give people a safe way to do a thought experiment about having that kind of income, and will let us give some examples about how someone might go about pursuing it in a way that could be safe to try and helpful. And we put a high number in as an example in part because I work with individuals on their finances, and I have the benefit of seeing lots and lots of budgets and seeing lots and lots of incomes. And what I'm seeing is that all of my clients who make less than $50,000 or $60,000 a year and have to pay for all of their own food and housing and transportation and childcare and try to come up with savings and have a hope of figuring out money that isn't just for this month are really experiencing a lot of stress right now. And I'm seeing that at the moment, when people cross over $90,000 a year or more, there's a lot less stress. And there's a lot of data coming out to support that right now, that the average income needed across the US to cover average cost of living with only 50% of your income is in the cheapest places in the US, $86,000 a year. And in some of the more expensive places, over $135,000 a year. That doesn't mean that you can't make it work on less or that everyone needs to aim for that number. It indicates that if you are struggling at these lower incomes, it's because things are really expensive. And if inflation continues as it's been going, in the absence of a major policy intervention, it is going to require most of us to figure out how to cover high living expenses and how to keep bringing our ideal and income and the income that we're reaching for up and up again. So we use this high income example here to give your brain time to chew on and sit with a higher number, to picture it and to get more connected to it before the arc of history forces you to, if you're not ready. So we are going to do an exercise including these higher numbers. So Pippi is going to break it down for you, but in order to get ready, I want you to get out your list of criteria, get out that you're going to use, whether that's writing things down, whether that's drawing, whether that is your voice note, memo, doc, whether that is a digital place you're doing stuff. Get some water, get a snack, and Pippi, how do we do this?
The basic way that we're going to do this exercise is that we're going to do 2 rounds of brainstorming. And in the first round, you're going to try to see if you can come up with ideas that meet all of your criteria holistically. And then in the second round, you're going to break out each individual criterion and try to brainstorm it on its own. So let me explain in a little more detail. In this sample criteria list that we're giving, so I said these different kinds of elements. All right, I want to live close to friends, lots of free time, intellectually challenging. I make $94,000 to $104,000 a year. It matches my values, strengths, talents, and priorities. I get to move my body a lot during the day. I alternate between big bursts of work and then long periods of rest. And my work offers a lot of mental stimulation. And where we got that list is that these are the kinds of things that might have come out of doing these other exercises about your needs, your financial needs, your preferences, accepting how your brain and body work, etc. So if you were doing a brainstorm where you're trying to get at all that criteria as a whole, I could picture some different things that might be on that brainstorm list. So it could be, okay, maybe I'm a TV producer. Producers meet a lot of this criteria. They do these big bursts of work and then they get breaks. It's possible that a producer job could hit that target income. And part of why I know that is that I use tools like ONET and like the labor stats that we talk about in those earlier episodes to confirm that's a possibility. If you're a producer in this example, you could live in LA, and let's say the person who made this list has a lot of friends there, so it meets that friend criteria. It might be really mentally stimulating for them. So that's an example of a job that's holistically meeting a lot of the criteria that was on that list. Let's talk about the second round of brainstorming and how you would brainstorm the criteria separately. So what we're saying is like your ideal job maybe would combine everything, but sometimes it can just be too daunting to try to come up with one that combines everything. And if that's happening, try brainstorming them separately. And you're telling yourself, look, when you're working with each one, don't worry about the other ones. You're not responsible for it. Just take it one at a time. The other way that you do it is that you're trying to go for volume, not quality. So you want to just come up with as many ideas as you can. Don't evaluate them. Don't judge them. You're saying, I want to come up with as many ideas as I can. So this person might say, okay, living close to friends. Let's just work on this one. And they make a list of all the places they have friends. Phoenix, Hartford, Tampa, Albany. Then they're like, okay, lots of free time. Teachers, because they get summers off. Being a consultant who has a really high hourly rate, so that means they could work fewer hours. Seasonal work, like they work on a weed farm or they're a lifeguard. Oh my God. I just found out that lifeguards make so much money. It's amazing. So that might be on this person's list. Their next one is they're like, okay, what about topics that intellectually challenge and engage me? And maybe they put on this list things that are just like interesting to them, like historian, mediator, reporter, community organizer. To brainstorm the income one, so making $94,000 to $104,000 a year, remember, if you get stuck on that one, you don't have to guess. You can look it up. So go on ONET and look it up, or go to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. And again, this is linked in the workbook, but also just Google that and you'll find it.
Or think about the conversations we invited you to have with people who you know who have jobs that are making money. Right? You can go back to your research, friends.
So if you have an income-related criterion, you don't have to just guess. You can use all of those sources to look it up. And so let's say this person in that band that they were talking about, which is about $100,000, their list says actuaries, psychologists, tech jobs, university administrator, physical therapist. And then their next one is I get to move my body a lot during the day. And that's a totally different brainstorm list. Sports coach, physical therapist shows up again, dance teacher, carpenter. And the last part of their criteria was I alternate between big bursts of work and then long periods of rest. Let's say that's what works best for their brain and the rhythms of how their brain likes to work. They could be a set designer where they're going really hard when a production is happening and then they rest. They could be a choral director where they're getting ready for the big show and then they rest. They could be a landscaper where they work on a job and then the job ends. Or they could be a flight attendant where they do these long shifts that then come to an end. Here's some challenges that people have sometimes. So one that I already mentioned is that sometimes you're like, wait, I don't know about this. And you might have to look it up if you come to a type of criteria you don't know. Another great option is you can also brainstorm with other people. So a formal way of doing that is hiring a career coach to brainstorm with you, but there's also tons of free ways to do it. In the networking section of the workbook and in the networking episodes of the podcast that are going to come out, we're going to give you a lot of ideas about how to connect with other people. But you could ask your cousins or your friends or your neighbors. And if you've thought of one idea, so let's say you thought about sports coach, but you couldn't think of other ideas, you could also try to see if you could talk to somebody who's a sports coach and ask them, could you think of other ideas or what are other things you know about? Or if that is too intimidating and you're a shy guy, you could also just snoop on that field. So you could look for what's a professional association of soccer coaches and professional trainers. What does it say about them? And do they have a conference that I can look at? And what kinds of jobs do those people do? And what kinds of words do they use to talk about it? So if you get stuck brainstorming, don't despair. Do a little more research and talk to people. Thanks for talking about brainstorming with us.
I don't know if you're feeling a little brain pooped out from even considering brainstorming. So this is why we say have a snack, stay hydrated, and chip away a little bit at a time at a brainstorm. I like to have a 20 to 30 minute brainstorm sesh, and maybe you need 10 or 15 minutes to get ready, but you don't have to do this for 14 hours in a row. You can sit down for 30 or 45 minutes, get back up, and come back to it. And it'll let your brain percolate in the background because you've already done so much work researching, setting criteria, and getting yourself in a mental space where it's okay to come up with 60 to 80% ideas, right? You're not writing your permanent plan for life. You are just brainstorming what might be true. What's great about brainstorming is little cool threads and patterns start to emerge in there that give you a little more information. And in our next episode, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how you pull some stuff out of your brainstorm and make a little mini decision. So noodle around, think about some ideas, and come back and listen to the next episode when you are asking the question, what do I do with all these sticky notes? Anything else, Pippi?
Just remember, the number one tip for brainstorming is don't evaluate or judge the ideas. So when you're brainstorming, the number one thing that you're focusing on is quantity, not quality. Let it rip. And if you get stuck, take a break, go on a walk, do something else, talk to somebody else, and then try again. Quantity, not quality. And next episode, we're going to talk about quality, which is how you start figuring out which of these are actually a good idea. And I can answer that for you right now, which is that making sandcastle proposals as your job is your destiny. So it's been great doing this podcast with you. It's now over because we solved your career. You're a sandcastle artist now. I'm so happy for you.
It's going to be beautiful. You're helping happy people be happier. It's great.
We'll see you next time when we judge all these ideas very harshly.
Bye.